My name is Jasmina Založniik, and I will moderate this panel now after the two lectures by Branislav Jakovljević, who is now in USA and joined us through Zoom, and Tomislav Medak, who is with me sitting here. We decided to actually turn around the lectures, and first will be Branislav Jakovljević speaking about experimental ownership, immaterial labor, and socially owned property. And after him, it will be Tomislav Medak. Just to say a few words about both of the authors. Branislav Jakovljević is professor in the Department of Theater and Performance Studies at Stanford University. His research focuses on performance theory, performance, politics, avant-garde, and experimental theater, and currently also on radical performance and ethics. His most recent book that will be also, let's say, translated very soon in Slovene language is Alienation Effect, Performance and Self-Management in Yugoslavia, 1945 to 1991. And it was published in 2016. Afterwards, he also published one book in Belgrade, which is, if I say it in Serbian, Smrznuti magarac I drugi eseji in 2017. And beforehand, he also published another book, Danil Kartis, Writing and the Event. Tomislav Medak, to also introduce him. He's our great friend and colleague from Bad Company, but also at the moment a PhD researcher at Coventry University Center for Post-Digital Cultures, who focuses on political economy and technology and the planetary ecological crisis. He's also a part of the theory and publishing team of Multimedia Institute MAMA in Zagreb, and he's editing books, also translating. He organizes lectures, performances, and is also like giving lectures himself. And today he will actually also accurately talk about one of his last initiated project, which is called Pirate Care Project. But now I'm passing the voice to Branislav. Maybe I can say that I was really fond of your lectures that I was able to hear at PCRs, and it was always very inspiring to see how you are like twisting the subjects or proposals to different modes of performativity, theater, and also society. Thank you. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that great introduction. I wish I could be there in person, but this is such a year. So I hope you can hear me well. I'll just get started. And I'll read my paper. If the connection is good, I'll stay afterwards. If not, I hope to see you in person sometime soon. So, while the Yugoslav experiment is often invoked in the context of real socialism of the second half of the 20th century, we can glimpse its full meaning only if we consider it in relation to the continuum of political and social practices that of self-organization during that time period. It ranged from experiments with workers' participation in the management of factories in several Western European countries to co-ops that sprung up across Europe and the US and beyond, to massive structural changes in political economies of nations such as those initiated in Chile in 1970 but never completed. One of high points of this planetary idea of self-management happened in May of '68, when the call for autogestion became one of the main demands of students and workers in France. Considering the wide support that May had among left-wing intellectuals, Felix Guattari's skepticism towards self-management comes as a bit of a surprise. In an article he published on June 8, just as the movement was shifting from students to workers and from Paris to other regions of France, he warned that self-management had become something of a moral principle, he said, and also that talk of political self-management may also be an all-purpose deceptive formula, end quote. 10 years later, in a book manuscript that was posthumously published as Lines of Flight, he had no qualms stating that, quote, the national programs in self-management of the Yugoslavian and Algerian type have turned out to be rather disappointing, end quote. However, he also added that there is no longer any doubt that the future of humanity on this planet depends on the success of making viable self-management systems take off decisively, end quote. However disappointing it might have turned out to be, the central tenet of Yugoslav self-management, that it has to be established on the firm ground of socially owned property, is worth examining. In Yugoslavia, self-management took off decisively, as it were, on June 27, 1950, with the federal parliament's adoption of the basic law on management of state economic enterprises by workers' collectives, osnovni zakon o upravljanju državnim privrednim preduzećima i višim privrednim udruženjima od strane radnih kolektiva. The occasion was marked with countrywide ceremonies of turning factory keys to the workers. Only a year later, the passing of another federal law received almost no public attention. This law regulated the status of the free artist, slobodni umetnik, which was an entirely new institutional regulation in Yugoslav culture. 12 years later, in 1963, this law was enshrined in clauses 14 and 45 of the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So the free artist was built into Constitution. If the introduction of self-management went under the banner factories to the workers, then the slogan marking the legal regulation of the free artist status could have been something like art to artists. This new employment category meant that, unlike during the administratively regulated period of Yugoslav economy, when all professional artists were on the payroll of state institutions, they could now act as independent contractors. The establishment of self-management as the law of the land changed the legal status of workers. Instead of being hired in state-owned enterprises, they were invited to associate their labor and use socially owned means of production. That enabled them to retain partial ownership of the products of their labor, thus making self-management the real dynamo of the entire political economy of the country. This called for a complete overhaul of property relations and creation of socially owned property. What did that mean for the artists, and especially for free artists? The products of artistic labor, especially in performing arts, are far less tangible, harder to quantify and to own and possess. From the perspective of the state, it would have been much more practical to keep artists employed and attached to art institutions. Still, it was important to Yugoslav lawmakers to make sure the artists didn't do that if they didn't want to. So why even go there? What can the immaterial labor of artists tell us about socialist self-management and especially about its key feature of socially owned property? From its inception in the early 1950s to its butchering in the process of privatization 50 years later, social property in Yugoslavia went through a number of transformations. Perhaps the most reliable piece of information that the entry on socially owned property in Encyclopedia of Self-Management provides is that it is a historical category and as such the subject of continuous change. Indeed, social property is a process. By the end of Yugoslavia's run, even experts tended to dismiss social property as a kind of property that belongs to everyone and no one. Perhaps the best way to approach the mystery of social ownership to contemporary audience would be by comparing it with common property, which gained renewed attention in recent discussions about economically sustainable solutions to the climate crisis. Like the commons, social property is a form of collective ownership. However, unlike social property, the commons is a pre-capitalist form of ownership. The records of this form of property go back to Roman times and are far from being limited to Europe. In some of its forms, it still survives in the West and in other parts of the world, from common pastures in Swiss villages to common water sources in India. Unlike the commons, social property has not been established through customs and oral agreements over centuries. Instead, it was the result of a series of complex political, legal, and economic operations. Far from transcending periods and cultures in Yugoslavia, it was inseparable from the historical sequence that followed the Second World War. Initially, social property was the result of two reconfigurations. First came the expropriation of expropriators, and only 5 years later, the expropriation of the state. Therefore, to put it differently, first came the Soviet-style nationalization of private property and its transformation into state property, which was after Yugoslavia split from the Soviet Union, turned into social property. To a great degree, this slalom of Yugoslavian state created lasting misunderstandings about the nature and scope of social property. Legal experts writing on the subject included in this category all forms of property that were once owned by the state, such as agricultural land and urban lands, forests, but also commercial and apartment buildings, as well as public goods, including roads, bridges, streets, rivers, ports, and so on. This kind of state proprietorship of assets that are considered of public interest was not limited to Yugoslavia or even to the socialist world. In France of the 1960s, most of them came under control of the newly minted Ministry of Collective Equipment. Only the French can come up with something like this. The initial impulse for Guattari's work on lines of flight, which he composed under a much clunkier working title, Collective Equipment and Semiotic Subjugation, could be traced to a conversation he had with Gilles Deleuze, François Fourquet, and Michel Foucault in the early 1970s. In this conversation, published as Equipments of Power, Towns, Territories, and Collective Equipments, Foucault takes the roadways or highways as his example of collective equipment in order to single out three key characteristics of this kind of property. First, the production of production. Roads provide access to mines, factories, and so on. Production of demand. They also provide access to market, and mutual adjustment of these two. As Foucault points out, the forms of collective equipment are instances in which the state becomes visible. They are, as he says, the elements of its crystallization. Deleuze, in the course of the conversation, added that one of the key aspects of collective equipment is that it is, quote, completely evacuated from a capitalist regime. Crucially, this property is defined by the right of use and not by the relation of ownership. So these are the funds that are not invested in the market. They are pulled out of circulation. Separated from collective activities of industrial production, which is in capitalist society held in private hands, collective equipment is that zone of non-production that creates the conditions of production. The examples of collective equipment range from public infrastructure such as highways and telephone companies to services such as education, police, and to a certain degree, art. With the institutionalization of the free artist, art as a form of public property in Yugoslavia gained a whole new dimension. But let's not sugarcoat this. This innovation, the institution of the free artist, this innovation in the social status of artists was not the outcome of the symbolic position they held in Yugoslav society, but of the internal logic of socialist self-management. So they didn't do it for the love of artists, because of their love of artists, but because of the internal logic of what they were doing. In order to understand the true significance of this investment of the Yugoslav state in the artist, we have to go back to the very beginning of its decisive departure from command economy, which was in great degree engineered by Boris Kidrić, the country's leading economist of the post-war period. Maybe some of you have heard of him, maybe not, but I'll just a brief background. In charge of the Central Planning Commission immediately after the war, Kidrić was the moving force behind the Yugoslav first five-year plan. As one of the main strategists in charge of the Yugoslav economy at the time of the country's split with USSR, he was also one of the key architects of socialist self-management. In the immediate aftermath of Yugoslavia's break with Stalin, Kidrić called for the decentralization of planning, not for its complete abolition. In one of his key texts from this time, Thesis on the Economy of the Transitional Period in Our Country from 1950, he proposed setting up planning on two levels, basic and operative. Generated by the Central Planning Office, the basic plan sets up proportions. It gives, as Kidrić said, the general direction of the plan for all areas of industry and social life, end quote. The operative planning, on the other hand, is in the hands of workers' collectives, and it responds, quote, to the laws of supply and demand within the general proportions outlined by the basic plan, end quote. Kidrić's goal was not to create a compromise between planned and market economy, but to harness the force of the market to modify the plan as it unfolds, and thus to provide it with flexibility. This schema maps perfectly onto Guattari's idea of the molar as that which pertains to dominant structures of power, and the molecular as the dynamics that take place on inter and intrapersonal level. If basic planning of proportions operates and organizes collective equipment, then the operative planning has the potential to unleash, for the first time in Yugoslavia and in the socialist world, what Guattari called collective assemblages, those rhizomatic processes that constitute, he writes, the place where everything that remains alive in the socius takes refuge, and from where can start off again in the construction of another world, end quote. The story of self-management in Yugoslavia is the story of creating the conceptual space for collective assemblages together with the empowerment of the instruments for their control and subjugation by the state. A glimpse of the true potential of operative planning emerges in certain theoretical elaborations of the general schema of planning on the level of proportions and collectives. Writing a decade after Kidrić's premature death in 1953 at the age of 41, Serbian legal scholar Andrija Gams recognized that operational planning could become the defining principle of self-management and a transformative force for the entire society. Gams saw in a consistent implementation of the principles of self-management and social ownership the prospect for the development of democratic relationships in the society, not only in a legal, but also in a factual manner, end quote. In his vision, the relations of ownership in the broadest sense would open the way for members of the society, quote, to participate in governing of the state and to control the state apparatus and its power. This could, he speculated, set in motion the mechanism of withering away of the state as an institution of repression. And now a bit longer quote from Gans. In our system of decentralization of economic units and their coordination through market by the means of commodity production, there is no capitalist as the owner of an economic unit. In our society, the subject of that economy, the human foundation that manages and administers the economic unit as a legal entity, can be only the workers' collective as a self-managing unit, end quote. According to this schema, the turning over of the means of production to their users was supposed to be just the first step in the process of transmission of this industrial democracy to the society at large. The final goal is the social, economic, and legal system that promotes self-organization of collectivities that are, as Gans wrote, free social organizations which no longer depend on the law, that is, on the state, for their formation and existence. This freedom of association coincides with the central idea of the free artist as the legal and constitutional institution within Yugoslav self-management. And indeed, it was in associations of artists, not of workers, that the principle of free social organization saw its realization in Yugoslavia. For example, the dark wave in Yugoslav cinema of the 1960s was carried out by film workers associations, Filmske radne zajednice, established and managed by film artists and professionals who freely associated their labor. They came together. Precisely when this cinematic practice was brutally shut down by the state, the principle of free association sprang up again, and in a completely different form, in the activities of groups of conceptual and performance artists that came to be known as new art practice in Yugoslavia. The one thing that these two art movements had in common was their critical stance towards Yugoslav society. I contend that it was them and not the philosopher kings in the Yugoslav League of Communists who were what Guattari called the militants of self-management. Those, as he writes, who at a practical level are taking charge of the intersection of power formations and machines of desire with which they are confronted, end quote. They practiced this militancy not by adhering to the command of the basic plan, but precisely by doing the opposite, through operations that not only expanded and transformed the principles of self-management, but also discovered vast areas of unmanageability ignored and suppressed by the basic plan. Indeed, if the Association of Filmmakers and Conceptual Artist Groups were the undercommons of sorts, they were not alienated from the realm of production in Yugoslav society. They were, in other words, fully integrated in Yugoslav economy, which was based on the idea of combination of planned and commodity production. While getting rid of private property, socialist self-management retained the commodity form of production. That is why the Slovene economist Alexander Bajt was correct to point out the contradiction that mired legal and economic interpretations of social property. In Yugoslavia, the right of use, which the Luz recognized as the democratic right par excellence when it comes to collective equipment, was expanded to equipment of action, that is to say, to all means of production. Bajt suggests that this generates a dual structure of ownership. On the one hand, the legal owner, the legal holder of the right to use of, say, a parcel of land often is not the same person who, as Byte writes, appropriates the product of a parcel of land, which makes him or her the economic owner of the land. And the same goes to immaterial goods such as patented inventions, performances, and so on. To put it rather simply, the dualism of property ownership is determined by the very nature of commodity production. On the one hand, there is an entrepreneur who is the owner of the physical means of production, and on the other hand, the owner of capital, a venture capitalist who invests in that entrepreneur. In Yugoslavia, the elimination of private capital rearranged this division of economic ownership so that the society becomes the investor and the workers' collectives the entrepreneurs. According to Byte, since the means of production are the subject of the rights of use and not of ownership, capital, understood as accumulation of past surplus income, becomes the main form of social property in Yugoslavia. Quote, work collectives themselves decide on the form of concrete means of production to be given to the capital, which is social property, end quote. In Yugoslav self-managing socialism, the free artist was in the same position as a workers' collective. So they had at their disposal social property, right? This institution was, as far as I know, the only instance in which this kind of entrepreneurial function was relegated to an individual rather than to a collective. Boom. There is hardly a better example of the transformation of the social sphere that took place in Yugoslavia within a very short period of time than the social and economic position of the free artist. Importantly, legal norms that regulated this status were tied to social security and pension funds. It is no less significant that the professional artists associations and not political bodies played a key role in the process of nominating and awarding this title to individual artists. Last but not the least, and this would sound like science fiction to artists today in liberal economy, it was not only the artists themselves who made contributions to their benefits and pension funds. More often than not, these payments came from the Fund for the Improvement of Cultural Activities that each federal republic had. So basically, the contributions were made by the state, by these funds, from the social property. Now, with the extraordinary exception of the last one, none of these features was unique to Yugoslavia. As much as theoreticians of Yugoslav self-management try to make the case for Yugoslav exceptionalism, by the second half of the 20th century, these kinds of social protections were standard in bourgeois states throughout Western Europe. According to sociologist Robert Castel, already in the 19th century, bourgeois state started recognizing the need for these kinds of safeguards, which came to constitute what he calls, guess what, social property. So just a brief explanation of this institution. Castel points out that the aporias of private property did not result only in revolutionary action on the part of the workers, but also in a series of concessions that came from the bourgeois state. With the sharp increase of unpropertied classes over the course of the 19th century, the traditional identification of property with security became insufficient as a guarantor of the political stability of the state. As wage labor became a permanent way of life of an ever-increasing number of landless workers, their condition of impermanence started to affect the entire industrial society. As Castel observed, the bourgeois public officials realized that to allow the non-owning class to proliferate, often in a state of dereliction, was to sanction the presence of a zone of an ever more massive and potentially explosive vulnerability condemned to a permanent insecurity, end quote. In other words, the economic vulnerability of wage earners easily translated into a much broader social insecurity. In order to mitigate this permanent source of instability, the state did not only deploy repressive force, but also resorted to invention and construction of social property as an analogon to private property. The goal was to make, Castell writes, available to non-property owners a type of asset that was not the direct possession of a private holding or patrimony, but a right to access to collective goods and services which had a social purpose, ensuring the security, the social security of the members of modern society and reinforcing their interdependence in such a way that they continue to constitute a society, end quote. Of course, there are limits to the analogy with the private property. For example, social property was not transferable, thus placed out of the reach of the market. According to him, the goal, according to Castell, the goal of social property was not to generate wealth, but to produce rights, such as the universal right to pension, which became the staple of the social state, as he called it. Like other forms of collective equipment, the security function of social property was not only in the pacification of an exploited segment of the population, but in anticipation, direction, and channeling of social processes and ensuring that a mass of individuals becomes integrated into a coherent society. In short, the institution of social property is inseparable from the ideals and practices of what Foucault called societies of security. In his work of the late 1970s, he proposed that unlike disciplinary model of power, security apparatuses don't prohibit but regulate behaviors. And further, if disciplines focus on normation, security mechanisms engage in operations of normalization. To put it somewhat crudely, if the goal of disciplinary societies is to make social processes predictable, societies of security focus on their probability. Foucault observed that disciplinary and security techniques are not mutually exclusive and that they cohabit in different proportions in different societies. This in itself forms a range of disciplinary and security societies, and Yugoslavia occupied a curious place on that spectrum as well. As I suggested recently in the foreword to the Slovene edition of Alienation Effects, while the elements of disciplinary techniques of power were much more prominent in Yugoslavia than in most of Western society, at the same time, Yugoslavia had a significantly larger number of features of the society of security than any socialist state. Seen from this perspective, the bloody disintegration of Yugoslavia marked not only the end of self-managing socialism, but the beginning of something much larger and more destructive and only seemingly not as bloody. An all-out attack on the part of neoliberals on the fundamental institutions of social state. It is worth remembering that one of the main operations of neoliberalism is the extraction of wealth from social property. Is it at all surprising that the struggles of the Precarity in France at the beginning of the 2000s were triggered by neoliberal attacks on the pension code? And can it make anyone wonder that at the center of this conflict were the intermittents employed in performing arts? These struggles expose the dual operations of the state, which not only yields to, but actively assists neoliberal forces. On the one hand, it promotes the industrialization of culture and the establishment of the dictatorship of entertainment. and the so-called culture industry. And on the other, it attempts to wrestle social property from its protected place and introduce it into market, and in doing so, to abolish it. As Maurizio Lazzarato narrates, the collective action against this brutal takeover of the social state by neoliberal forces resulted in the production of new forms of mutuality and coordination among precarious workers. He correctly points out that they can come only from experimentation with apparatuses of being together and being against, which simultaneously takes up the already codified producers of politics again and invents others, end quote. While in the realm of politics, these movements demonstrated their extraordinary creative potential, in the realm of economics, they didn't move far beyond the conservative agenda of the preservation of rights. The struggle, I'm afraid, is much harder, for the main stake in it is the social property. The neoliberals smelled blood and they won't give up. After all, we have seen in Yugoslavia to which extremes they are prepared to go. My main goal in revisiting social property in Yugoslavia and institutions that came out from it was not to mournfully remind everyone of what was lost in the defeat of self-management, but to show what was gained with its implementation in the first place. So in the conclusion, I want to ask, what kind of opening, what kind of event was Yugoslav self-management? Is there anything in it that is worth fighting for still? Following Guattari and Deleuze, the Lazzarato posits that the event is immanent to history but not reducible to it. Like his intermittence, we can say that in its emergence as an event, self-management departs from its historical conditions and norms to create something new, new possibilities of actions and new modes of subjectification. The event is that which is irregular and unpredictable. In Yugoslavia, the unforeseen emerged on the level of the operations, which did not become the subject to the laws of the market, but instead became permanent generators of subjectivities that refused to conform with the basic plan. Already in the 1970s, early 1970s, Edward Cardell could wrap social property in a nice ideological package. Quote, the social historical meaning of self-management is in establishing of production relation based on the social ownership of the means of production, end quote. And then to add a bow tie by concluding that in it, in an ever-increasing proportion, dominates the appropriation of the base on the basis of work instead on the basis of private property. This is an epochal operation as it shifts the basis of the subject in law from property as it is in bourgeois societies to labor. The molar structure of the Yugoslav League of Communists knew what it was dealing with, and it always made sure to regulate collectivities formed by these subjects using both disciplinary and security techniques. However, the cracks kept opening up. For example, by placing the free artist in the same legal position as workers' collectives, the law opened up new and unpredictable forms of subjectification which were explored by artists engaged in new art practices. They demonstrated that collective assemblages consist not only of people and things, subjects and objects, producers and the means of production, but that they could be made of sounds and body parts, of geometric lines and decisions, of becomings and non-linear sequencing. And that is where bifurcations, openings, and reconnections come into play. If Yugoslav experience in the second half of the 20th century was marked by dualities between East and West, centralization and federalization, political monism and industrial democracy, that is because self-management always creates a fork in the road. It is a bifurcation between the global and the local, the universal and the specific, between hegemonic strategies and operational tactics, and between safety of private and experimentation of social ownership. Self-management is the opening of a dilemma, and it demands a decision. Why cannot have it both ways, period? It rejects compromise, even if it's wrapped in the ecstatic mists of dialectics. The real decision self-management is asking of us to make at this moment is whether to resign ourselves to the dictatorship of entertainment or to take back what is properly ours and expropriate the expropriators of social property. Thank you.
Thank you for this inspiring lecture, and the question will come afterwards. I think there are so many that could be raised, and also thank you for reminding us on the past.
Okay, I hope the connection worked.
Yeah, it worked well.
Okay.
So far. So now it's Tomislav Medak, and he will talk about no return to self-management. Self-management is the only way forward. It's somehow very much linked to what Branislav was talking, but from a very different perspective, I would say, or a bit different perspective.
Moram tu izvesti neku akrobatiku. Nešto mi palo. Samo moram malo približiti da mogu dosegnuti. Ok, super. Well, three remarks. First, I'm ecstatic to be here. Immense gratitude to Maska for organizing this happy centennial. I hope that at least I'm contributing a little bit to thinking what might make it possible for Maska to celebrate a bicentennial. Second, I don't feel much being an artist anymore, and somehow I've left the orbit of theater, or I'm leaving the orbit of theater. But again, I feel such a big attachment to this space, to the works I've seen in Ljubljana, to the works that Maska has produced, and to the texts that I've read in Maska. Much of my current concern relates much more to what ecological economics is demonstrating, and that is that productivist, capitalist, extractivist system cannot be decoupled from destruction of nature, and second, that capitalist democracy is dissociating the political from the economic. And third, I think that much of what I'll be talking about has been previously said by Kunst, Peteršin, Bachelet, Cobalt, Wells, Guattari. So maybe I should just rest here and you ask them questions. Just to show you. So I wanted to introduce with this dedication to David Graeber, comrade who has tragically passed away last week, and who in a way lavished his intellectual brilliance on the idea that things are not a foregone conclusion, that they are not what they seem, that the division of labor in contemporary societies and our dependence on economy of debt is not what it seems, and that in that sense it's eminently mutable. We can change it by working collectively. Okay, let me start. The sustainability of human societies facing runaway destabilization of planetary ecosystems hinges decisively on their capacity to transform the dominant system of social needs and the capitalist system of provision for those needs. An ecologically safe and socially just future for all hinges on whether they will be able to transform from the lowest to the highest level of social organization their development in order to respect, first, the dependence of human societies on the stability of non-human nature, and second, the interdependence of humans in and between societies. However, for as long as the realm of social needs for those who are producers and thus providers in those societies remains determined by external mechanisms of generalized competition, commodity production, and surplus accumulation, the transformation of the system of social needs necessary to achieve a safe and just future will remain elusive and contested. The primary reason for that is that in the present-day democracies, so the majority of population, the producers, the providers, get to decide on everything but the realm of necessity. As people are never asked what needs to be produced and consumed, how that can be fit within the planetary limits, and how the socially necessary labor will be divided between members of society, the problems of ecological transition remain alien to them, to the majority. Thus, it is only in an economic democracy that human freedom can be achieved within planetary boundaries, within a system where people collectively determine their social needs and the labor that will go into providing for them. If this sounds like self-management it definitely is. A free society of producers self-regulating the realm of necessity. That's the notion of freedom, collective freedom, unlike individual freedom. However, this time around, so comparing to the period of socialism and socialist revolutions, this time around with a fundamental proviso in respect of our human and non-human interdependence. In 1973, Rudi Supek, a former World War II French resistance fighter, member of Buchenwald resistance, and co-founder of the Praxis School of Humanist Marxism, published a book reflecting on the impeding planetary crisis titled This Only Earth, Ova jedina zemlja. Synthesizing the findings of the limits to growth, the interventions of the emerging environmental movement, and the groundbreaking insights of the early ecological economics, Supek's book joined the call of intellectuals such as Andre Gortz, Dennis and Donella Meadows, Rachel Carson, and Murray Bookchin to reconsider the continued, unsustainable, growth-oriented imperial model of economic development that was destabilizing local environments and increasingly planetary biosphere. Writing from the vantage point of Yugoslav's self-managed socialism, and on the heels of fresh readings of Marx through economic philosophic manuscripts of 1844, which were discovered a little bit earlier, and Grundrisse, Supek's vision of ecological transformation remains uncannily contemporary. It is a transition from an economy based on accumulation to an economy based on conservation of matter, where the stocks of natural resources are maintained as constant as possible, and their recycling and regeneration made a constraining condition on economic process. To a self-managed, so transition to a self-managed economy that would primarily be oriented toward human needs and not the accumulation of surplus based on the exploitation of labor. Almost 50 years have passed since then. The warnings of Supek and his contemporaries of the impeding planetary crisis have largely proven correct. However, the question is, why did their call remain unheeded back in their day? That is not hard to answer, and there is a cautionary tale in that story for us in the present. In the year of publication of Supek's book, the first oil crisis and the collapse of Bretton Woods system sent the global economic system into a tailspin, unleashing a protracted downturn that persisted long into the 1980s and precipitated the collapse of socialist projects around the world. The bipolar Cold War world order collapsed and was superseded by a financialized global capitalism. As Francis Fukuyama famously reasoned, the march of history had come to an end. The world had arrived in the permanent now, where the political and economic system built on the pursuit of individual material interests, free markets, liberal democracies, and capitalist economic growth would continue to dominate happily ever after. Yet already in 1970s, in Supek's 1970s, it was becoming clear that the contextual condition of what a future transformation, or simply future as such, might mean, that these contextual conditions to understanding future have changed. Future was becoming radically different from what it had been half a century or even 20 years earlier, as socialist Yugoslavia was starting. It had become a rejective future of a world that was, as Herman Daly said, a full world. A full world of the growing detritus of the colonial extractivism and productivism on a planetary scale, of which socialism was not innocent. It was becoming unwelcoming, threatening with uncertainties that even scientists are at pain to predict. A future facing us with the dim prospect for survival of entire societies and the entirety of humanity. This rejective future, so the future that is definitely totally different than the future of, utopian future of social revolutions in the early 20th century. This rejective future is selectively sensitive to different strategies of future-oriented action. Not everything will work. Ecosystem services have been exhausted beyond their regenerative limits, some irreversibly so. So not all futures, or in the jargon of IPCC, not all shared socioeconomic pathways are livable in this full world. Yet in the present, we have no choice but to pursue a future-oriented action of mutually reinforcing adaptation and restoration to achieve a livable future for all. Okay, that's so much about logical and historical necessity of an ecological transition, or transition toward an ecological self-managed social life. But the logical and historical necessity speaks little of our strategic capacity to actually achieve that emancipatory goal. I firmly believe that there is no one single strategy, nor that there is any single strategy in particular that is certain to bring us toward the achievement of that goal. With this in mind, I want to shift to a less theoretical key and talk of a project my mates, Valeria Graziano and Marcel Mars, have been developing together with me over the last 2 years, titled Pirate Care. It was mentioned here before, so it might be a bit pedestrian. Apologies for that, particularly for those who have already heard about it, and this might be all redundant. So Pirate Care is a project documenting disobedient forms of collective organization of provision for social needs in the present that we believe are practically and prefiguratively shaping the terrain of struggle going forward. I would venture to say that they are forms of reparative self-management in the making. This is going even more pedestrian. No, this is canonical definition of care by John Toronto and Bernice Fisher. In the most general sense, care is a species activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we may live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. Throughout our lives, we depend on the support of our friends, kin, strangers, and institutions to sustain ourselves, as well as to sustain the world in which we and the future generations have to live. That interdependency of humans and non-human nature in social and ecological reproduction defines the relations of care. And the effort to sustain those relations defines the labor of care. Yet over the last decades of financialized global capitalism, the convergence of processes that include the rollout of workfare, rollback of reproductive rights, austerity measures, or criminalization of migration have denied that vital support to many. Against this background of institutionalized negligence, there is a growing wave of mobilizations and resistance focusing on care that we can witness addressing a number of fundamental social and human needs. Let me give you a couple of examples. The recent Docs Not Cops campaign in the UK, with doctors refusing to carry out document checks on migrant patients. The growing resistance to homelessness via the reappropriation of houses left empty by speculators, as in the case of Le Pai in Spain. The defiance to legislation making homelessness illegal in Hungary in October of 2018. Or civilian search and rescue missions, such as those conducted by Sea-Watch, that defy the criminalization of solidarity in the Mediterranean. And to give you a couple of more examples, in Greece, grassroots clinics set up by the Solidarity movement that have responded to the draconian cuts to public services by providing medical attention to those without a private insurance. In Italy, precarious parents without recourse to public childcare organizing their own pirate kindergartens. This is the example of Sopra Sotto in Milan. In Spain, the feminist collective Ginepunk developing a toolkit for gynecological self-diagnosis to allow all those excluded from reproductive health services, such as trans women, drug users, or sex workers, to perform basic checks on their own bodies. The collective Women on Waves that has been providing safe contraceptive and abortion operations to women in countries where those are not available or are illegal, at times using boats stationed in international waters like veritable care pirates. And finally, pirate care practitioners liberate knowledge where access is denied, as in the case of shadow libraries, including our own Memory of the World, so the project that Marcel and I work on. Crucially for us doing pirate care as a project, all these practices share a willingness to openly disobey laws and executive orders whenever those stand in the way of safety and solidarity, as well as to politicize that disobedience to contest the institutional and structural status quo. That disobedience and that politicization are what qualifies them as pirate care in our eyes. Pirate Care as a project aims specifically to activate collective learning processes from the situated knowledge of these practices. In this, we have been inspired by the phenomenon of #syllabi, that is, crowdsourced online syllabi created by social movements in response to situations of intense antagonism, such as Ferguson's syllabus created in the aftermath of police killing of Michael Brown, or Gaming and Feminism syllabus in the wake of Gamergate harassment campaign, or Trump 101, or Trump syllabus 2.0, or Standing Rock syllabus in 2016. Political struggles against structural domination, oppression, and violence in the present are continuing the legacy of critical pedagogies of earlier social justice movements, anti-racist, feminist, disability or labor, that coupled the processes of political subjectivation and structural transformation with that of collective education. Building on that reflection, we have set out to develop a radical pedagogy approach that would help social justice initiatives write online syllabi of their own, and to do so in a technological framework that would enable the syllabi, as well as the collections of texts that accompany those syllabi, to be collectively created, easily preserved, and maintained independently from large digital platforms. The first round of topics for the Pirate Care syllabus was written in November of last year and launched on March 8th this year. The syllabus, an expanding work in progress, currently includes topics on criminalization of solidarity, sea rescuing care, commoning care work and childcare, debt and housing struggles, psychosocial autonomy in insurrectionary movements, community safety from racialized policing, transfeminist hacking, hormone toxicity and bodily sovereignty, gender equality in tech milieus, and politicizing digital piracy. However, caring is not intrinsically nice. It always involves, and this was said before, power relations and processes of discipline, exploitation, and harm. It is a necessary and skilled form of labor that is shouldered by workers, mostly unwaged women and migrants, who themselves receive the least amount of care while serving those who take care labor for granted. Reciprocity and solidarity in this space are not implied. To address this disparity on which provision of care rests in most societies, practices of pirate care are experimenting with forms of egalitarian self-organization, alternative approaches to social reproduction, and the commoning of tools, digital tools in many cases. They organize the labor necessary for social reproduction in an autonomous way that rejects to be mediated by the dominant forms of state or capital. They are neither configured in the form of services to buy or sell, nor as bureaucracies to comply with or fight against. On March 14th, with the COVID-19 outbreak in Europe, we have transformed our work into a collective note-taking effort to document organizing of mutual aid, solidarity, and care in response to the crisis, titled Flatten the Curve, Grow the Care. What are we learning from COVID-19? With the participation of a broader pirate care network, we have collected and created around 15 notes, instructions, and how-tos that are coming from and are used by grassroots initiatives across Europe. The notes include information on how to assist people in home isolation, organize a solidarity kitchen, or mutual aid for the jobless, advice on reproductive rights, home violence, and childcare in the quarantine, as well as write-ups on the implications of the pandemic on disability, environmentalism, and technology. The famous graph in the title represents two curves standing for higher or lower rates of contagion. You can see the graph over there. And unspecified healthcare capacity represented as a straight line that the ideal pandemic curve should not breach. We wanted to highlight how that straight line is never a straight line, nor is the single line. It actually depicts the decline of society's capacity for care under the relentless neoliberalization and criminalization. Also, much in what has been termed the biggest crisis of care in the century isn't actually so new. With the pandemic, the pre-existing care crisis, until recently visible only on one side of the class, gender, and race divide, suddenly detonated as a generalized social threat. The lockdowns have revealed the fundamental dependence of societies on so-called essential workers, services, labor. The frontline workers in health and elderly care, in cleaning and food supply, or in transport, whose work is mostly invisible, devalued, and precarious, had no choice but to continue to go to work to not lose employment and income. Largely composed of women, people of color, and migrants, they had to risk infection, and their communities were predictably some of the hardest hit by the disease. The disease has largely remained on their side of the class, gender, and race divide. Conversely, all those who could shelter in place have experienced a rapid digitization of all aspects of their lives, transforming their homes into workplaces and surrendering all their social reproduction needs into the hands of tech giants. A radical separation between those two positions, operationalized through networked capital, is accelerating further fragmentation of the working class, disposability of their lives, and a diminished capacity to contest a growing techno-capitalist oligarchy. How am I doing with time?
You're fine.
Okay.
It's 39. So 5 more, 6.
I'll again jump the shark. What the present crisis has demonstrated is that the economies are embedded in and subordinate to the stability of societies. Let me take that again. What the present crisis has demonstrated is that the economies are embedded in and subordinate to the stability of societies. The planetary environmental crisis will demonstrate that societies are embedded in and subordinate to the stability of nature. The pre-existing capacity of care and ability for adaptation have been shown to be critically lacking, undercut by decades of neoliberal restructuring that have economically streamlined and thus crippled the social and ecological systems to be able to respond to a disease of whose imminence we were warned over and over. Just ponder, how is it possible that a mere couple of weeks of disruption can cause critical shortages of food in the most affluent nations? That 1.5 million people in the UK can go hungry for at least a day. That 15 million of those living from paycheck to paycheck in the US are expected to need assistance from food banks. How is it possible that in the global food system, where 1/3 of produced food is wasted, UN's World Food Programme is warning that 265 million will be pushed to the brink of starvation this year? How is it possible that even before this crisis, millions starved and depended on food stamps? That the most fundamental good for maintaining human lives, something that should be a global commons, can be so scarce yet wasted. Oops. Our comrades from Cooperation Birmingham have responded to what they understand as a combination of gross inefficiencies of the capitalist system of food provision, punitive means-tested food poverty mitigation by welfare institutions, and a larger political disempowering of the working class by organizing a solidarity kitchen in Birmingham. They have transformed the cooperative warehouse cafe and organized over 60 volunteers to deliver daily over 150 free warm meals to those in need across Birmingham. As they write, we need popular mutual aid efforts, such as Cooperation Birmingham, to become strong alternative institutions that take power from political elites and redistribute it among the working class. We need to have a major role in writing the new rules of the world to come. Another facet of the breakdown of the food provision system is the shortage of labor force. European farms are dependent on migrant seasonal labor that can be easily exploited and deported. Yet, with the epidemiological border closures, the countries of capitalist core that have illegalized and policed migrants face shortages of exploitable labor and had to organize special flying regime programs for workers from East European countries to arrive to, Germany or Austria in this case, to pick asparagus and sell it. These workers and their communities back home were provided no workplace nor Medicare protection. To counter this, a coalition of trade unions and activists in Austria called Saisonieri has been working with migrant seasonal workers to prevent exploitation, improve working conditions, and enforce their rights. They have put out a list of demands that includes higher wages, sanitary conditions, compensation for increased health risk, the abolition of both patriotic and anti-migrant discourses, and a more just system of food production in general. To go back to the question, The reason why the food system is so brittle is that all hyperdynamic, high-throughput systems subsumed under the imperatives of capitalist production require just-in-time pipelines. While seemingly flexible, these have little redundancy of supply and time to be adaptable to the uncertainties. This goes equally for commodities markets and labor markets. Global agricultural production has been streamlined to cut the cost of labor, technology, and land. The product is cheap, but distributed highly unevenly along different commodity chains, the product being food. No? In the aftermath of the present disruption, we are bound to see hyperautomation of farms and recasting of food sovereignty along nationalist lines. Freedom from backbreaking labor is good, and so is more food sovereignty. However, technology and nationalism will not do away with brittleness. What will do away with brittleness is a recoupling of food production, distribution, and consumption along the principles of abolition of unequal ecological exchange, exploitation of labor, and nationalism. Okay, let me just, Katja has already touched upon this. So, okay, let me finish. No. Deforestation, land use change, and agriculture contribute around 25% of global greenhouse gases emissions. They're the large driver of zoonotic spillovers such as SARS-CoV-2. No? This is what I sort of skipped, but you've heard the story. Global warming destabilizes entire ecosystems and destroys groups of interdependent species while creating conducive conditions for the spread of diseases. How do we counter the capitalist rationality of brittleness, ecological destabilization, and disease? Irrationality that pushes people to break their back from paycheck to paycheck, planetary ecology to hurtle toward the abyss, diseases to run roughhood through the human and non-human organization of life. There is no easy answer and no one answer. Just as there is really no one line representing baseline capacity of care in the pandemic, but rather many depending on your class, gender, race, territory, history. We need a different organization of collective provision for human needs in nature. Our way forward into a rejective future critically depends on the collective organization of adaptation, care, and mutual aid that will rewrite plural and create plural and resistant rules for a full world. Our destination, real and ideal, will be defined by a myriad of processes of reorganization, restructuring, and restoration at different scales. I would say repair, but there was a critical debate around repair, so I wouldn't go into that now, maybe in the questions, but yeah, reorganization, restructuring, and restoration at different scales. This might not be the only or winning strategy to overcome the dominative structure of capitalist extractivist system. Interconnectedness does not necessarily account for structure, and structure, I think, is important. But certainly, this is the substance of ecological and self-managed future for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tomislav. I don't know how to proceed now. Should also, like other guests, be invited to the stage and we share the stage with them? Like Katja, Natasha, Amaya, and we share the microphones and the discussion. But maybe shortly, just to somehow what echoed in this, like listening to these various lectures so far, it was on one hand this kind of globalization, decolonialization, situated knowledges, good practices, repair, conservation, disobedience, sustainability, and so on one hand, common collectivity, collectiveness, and on the other, we have still this kind of decreasing of social sphere, hegemony, private ownership, divisions of humanity, disability, constant economic growth, sinisters of capital, vulgarity, necropolitics, politics, and so on. So my question is like very maybe still utopic or kind of I try to grasp it, how to make all this kind of positive stuff that I mentioned at the beginning, how to make them come true, how to make them spread around. You were like both of you were claiming that self-management is kind of one of the organization or the principle that could be spread or should be spread and become more common. So is it really the way to make it like grassroots initiative on this level that that to bring the power from this very limited position, or to spread the power from this limited, let's say, grassroots positions, or should be like some other way, for example, like connected to hacking somehow the system, or to achieve something within the capitalist democracy, to take the position from those that have it, from the privileged. I don't know, now it's like it's a bit messy, but yeah, that's very basic. What do you think? How to continue, or how to spread, or how to make these voices more visible and these practices more livable or practiced? Whoever. Branislav, can you maybe start, and or should Tomislav?
Yeah. Why don't we? Yeah, Tomislav.
Tomislav, okay.
We live in a complex world, no, and that's the magic of capitalism, that it's able to connect that complex world through the invisible hand of the market and calibrate it thusly, driven by forces of capital accumulation. At the same time, it is producing homogeneity, decomplexifying systems in their specificity and their makeup. And that is not something that necessarily is at the level of the local. If you imagine large ecosystems such as the Amazon, for instance, it's highly complex and it's huge in planetary terms, yet industrial agriculture, deforestation, primarily for reasons of soybean farming and cattle raising, has been used to decomplexify these huge swaths of ecosystems. I think similar things are happening at the level of society. And for me, fundamental question is, how do we connect the specificity of the needs at various scales of social organization with the provision for those needs? Obviously, things can start local because we operate in a capitalist world. Everybody, in a way, or pretty much everybody, depends on wage to be able to provide for themselves. Hence, they cannot decouple easily. And it takes a lot of effort to put together various cogs to create a mechanism where many things, or an ecosystem of many things where production to the needs can function in a larger community. But I think we have both political and technological means to push toward growing the scale, not necessarily scaling up the local solutions, but being able to connect specific solutions to specific needs, to specific situations together. And ability to deal with that complexity is, I think, what we need to think going forward. How do we come there politically? There is no one strategy, as I said. I don't know, I'd like to be a purist, but I don't see much success coming from that. I would like to be a revolutionary Leninist Marxist, but it's hard, no? And then you have to start from somewhere, and I think there's an uncertainty to any strategy. I think there is a logical necessity that future societies will have to adapt in ways that are specific to their needs, but they might not, and many people will perish in the process, and many ecosystems will die off in the process. So I think that's where I'm at. No simple answer, but yeah, I guess political work at various scales.
Because basically, like after the final self-immolation of the self-management or Yugoslavia that was grounded on the self-management, like within the art culture, the art sector, we had the NGOization, like the dominant, so to say, takeover of the scenes. And I was considering starting my talk today, but due to the time limits, I actually wanted to share with you some minutes of Marva Arzanios, Who is Afraid of Ideology, where it's two-part project of hers in which she researches alternative ways to sustainability of, so to say, not giving up the means of protection, as is food, soil, water, and so on, into the state ownership, but different kind of ownership. And right now it's also within the especially North Syrian, but also going into Lebanon and so on. These kind of initiatives are basically experiencing NGOization. You know, and it somehow seems that this point of transition of NGO, it's obviously a useful tool to detach of detachment of the means. It's a question more than, I mean, it's an observation question. If maybe the organization of NGO itself that we are inhabiting, like for the most part, that it has maybe already in itself the grain of making this impossible. It's a question. To anyone who feels interpellated.
Or maybe they are just other more older dinosaur historical, like guilds and, you know, the sources of mutuality and so forth, where there were some kind of other relationships of collectivity than NGOs. They especially I know from again Lebanese case that it's a place how to maintain a status quo completely, and mostly with international forces claiming their own good intentions, but just really maintaining things in status quo. But regarding that and regarding your question and Jasmina's question, I mean if I look at the changes that I could observe in the small scale and mid-size institutions of art across Europe, but not only, especially not Europe, sorry, across, for example, former either settler colonial states or former colonies, there has been a great endeavor in changing the hierarchies and relationships within institutions, which are understood, as we heard today already, as assemblies of bodies. So it's no longer something that is rigid and infrastructural and given, but it's understood as something that can be composed, recomposed, rethought as an assembly of a body, of bodies. And with this, I mean, for example, there is a big change that I see, for example, about not only in relation to Black Lives Matter. This has been going on now since years. The kind of voluntarily diversification of who runs the institutions, who is working on which levels of decision-making, content-making, programming. And it goes, for example, in many of smaller scale institutions within the visual art field, it goes into more and more approaching and working with and employing of cultural workers coming from First Nations. And this I see as a kind of course, it's something that you have certain epidermic reaction of, oh gosh, I mean, that's it, the recuperation process has begun, also in the field of larger scale art field, let's say, but I see that how the way they wish to the way these institutions that are enabling that, how they wish to approach the questions of change, they rightly so, I would claim, start the change within their own working environments. So not only in, typically, for example, you have all this, now since decades there is this art and ecological, or ecological art interest in many, you know, among our fellow curators, artists, etc. And what is more and more debated, I see, at least around in the field in which I work, is that if it's taking place only on the level of programming, so only on the level of broadcasting and presenting, there cannot be a real change. It doesn't have much of a domet, much of a possibility to affect. If it starts to come into the ways the people are working together, and who are those people that are working together, then there is something that begins to shift. So I don't know if I answered, but that would be my observation.
Hi, I hope it's not too weird that I start to speak from the audience. So thank you all for your talks today. This was wonderful. I have a direct question for Tomislav, which is, I do want to push you towards a kind of a decision with relation to the state. So should initiatives like this, you know, Pirate Care that you've given us some wonderful examples, but should this kind of initiatives be taken over by the government, by the state, if you want, so that, you know, all these spontaneous initiatives become mandated by the government? Or would you rather that, you know, the state power dissolves as such, and, you know, that everything should be just a network of pirates, communes, or whatever you call them? I really want you to answer this. Where do you see the future of this? Because as it is, of course, it's only repairing work. It's really just, you know, doing. It's necessary and great work, but it's only repairing work. It's not really like a solution in itself. And then Branislav, this was brilliant, of course, and I'm extremely glad that you are able to present in some form, even though, of course, in person would have been better. And we are really looking forward to the publication of your wonderful, excellent book. I think this is now only a matter of weeks. And my question for you is, you were discussing the position of the art worker within Yugoslavia, and it seemed to me that we are today in a similar situation. I just wanted to underline this, that I think we are in a similar situation today, where an artist, in a way, is like the perfect worker for contemporary capitalism, in a sense that, you know, an artist is usually someone who is completely flexible, completely mobile, who doesn't really have many things that, well, tangle him to the ground or whatever. So I just wanted, you know, to ask if there's any, do you see any relationship with this? And now I think I just passed my mic to Bojana. All right.
Yes, so my question, I would attach my question would be, I'm also hardly waiting for the book. I was very glad to be acquainted about the book over the review by Ivana Bago. And I would like, because I'm myself interested into the failed women's emancipation project, or stopped or contra-revolutionary tendencies within the Yugoslav project. Like the gender dimension within the free self-management, self-managed artist. It's obvious that a lot of, like, if we take, for example, painters who got access to academies, then afterwards were denied access to art institutions, and so went to pursue a career as illustrators in publishing for minors. So, like, if you also had a look at the gender dimension within the self-management, because from the lens of today and from the, so to say, delivered or taken over canons, it seems that there is again a blind spot, even though it was self-managed, so to say, blind spot. Like that women's creativity was obviously not given further, in a sense.
Should I go?
Yes, please, yes.
Okay. All kinds of dissonances. Sometimes the connection is good, sometimes it kind of cuts off, so I'll try to respond the best that I can. In response to the first question, art, the status, the position of free artist, slobodni umetnik in Yugoslavia, and the position of the artist as paradigm, right, for the worker in neoliberal capitalism, I think there are some overlaps and some similarities, but there are ultimately fundamental differences. So I think that similarities that I think it's kind of strange. I don't see the people who are asking questions, so I'm responding to these voices. So the first question, this idea of artist as the ideal, the paradigm of labor that is flexible, unattached, that is fluid, that is adaptable, and all of that. It comes primarily from Boltanski and Chiapello, and as Lazzarato has shown in several of his works, that's to put it very nicely, an approximation, and put it bluntly, an invention by Boltanski and Chiapello. Indeed, the neoliberal capitalism takes these kind of art, this kind of labor as an ideal, but they largely make it up. Free artist in Yugoslav society was free not because they were unattached, not because they were available for hire, and that's also the case in France today. Basically, they are, their position, their status has to be tied with these kind of social protections and social, this kind of social security which neoliberal state is trying to eliminate and to get rid of. So while idealizing this kind of free, flexible worker, they're trying basically to eliminate the basis for that kind of labor. I hope that makes sense. I think the second question is great. Women in emancipation project in Yugoslavia. First of all, I just want to say that Yugoslav self-management did not as someone put it earlier, self-immolate. It was ruthlessly stamped down, it was ruthlessly defeated, and it was actually part of this. We can understand the logic behind that ruthless attack on Yugoslav management if we see it on the continuum of neoliberal policies that started precisely at that time. So when it comes to women and emancipation project, indeed, I think it's important to start with the idea of the subject and the forms of subjectification in Yugoslavia. And one thing that is really important there is that the Molar, as Guattari would put it, on the level of Molar politics, we're talking about precisely the bourgeois subject, male, adult working, right? And able. And that is actually the kind of subject that Kardelj is talking about, for example. That's the ideological subject of Molar idea of self-management in Yugoslavia. What comes as an undesired effect, the event of self-management is precisely the challenge, all kinds of challenges to that kind of subject. So subject that is not centered, subject that is not discrete, subject that is ultimately not male and able-bodied. So in new art practices, for example, we see a number of female accomplished artists, start from Sanja Iveković, not even to mention Marina Abramović or Nuša Dragan in Slovenia, or a number of stellar art historians who were, and art critics who were directly involved in new art practice, starting from Dunja Blažević to Jasna Tjardović, and so on and so on. So indeed, precisely this kind of challenging of this stable bourgeois model of subjectivity produced the conceptual space for intervention of feminist art and feminist thought in Yugoslav art of that time.
So first, maybe a gloss on repair. Viewed from an ecosystems perspective or ecological environmentalist perspective, repair has to do with restoration of those systems that are destroyed. And there are various aspects that in what I've used as the concept of full world need to be repaired. That includes reforestation or afforestation, soil restoration, and potentially and maybe greenhouse gases drawdown. So reduction of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and their storage. Because we are locked into global warming over a long period of time. I mean, we, future generations or whatever remains. And finding ways of constructing drawdown is important. So that includes repair prima facie. But I think more broadly, repair is dealing with the consequence of destruction and domination. No? And I think there is a lot of that. You might say that's negative work. That's not the work of construction. But I think we are at a point, again, primarily from maybe ecosystems, ecological point of view, where there's so much of it that future development cannot go around it, even centrally around it. No? Climate change being sort of an imposing issue here. So in that sense, I don't understand repair as necessarily maintaining institutional situations as they were or returning to a better before. I think it very much has to do with providing conditions for livable futures, which might not be perfect. No, it's kind of open. On the question of state, we live in this, the world system of states. And I think with, so this is my grand history, idea history of 20th century. Come 1918, there are three ideas around. Empire and, in our case, Pan-Slavic empire, empire of the downtrodden. Second, capitalist nation state, usually monoethnic. And third, Soviets. And basically you can view the 20th century as the battle of those three ideas in the space, in the territory that we inhabit. And capitalist nation state, monoethnic mostly, wins out, no? And that's the grim reality of nation states, and this defines the political terrain. Many of these projects that we are looking at, and they have their own self-definition. We kind of don't impose normative orientation or structure on them. We provide learning from them. No, that's the goal of Pirate Care as a project. But many of them have the understanding of transforming the status quo, which means transforming the state as well, or inserting oneself into political situations where you can transform the institutional and structural makeup of the world that they function in. And if you look, for instance, at the history of NHS, British health system, if it weren't for mutual organizations of the miners, there would never have been NHS. And that's basically the type of work we think many of these organizations are doing. And then there are obviously some that operate within the modality of dual power. Now, you would need to win power of the state. It's kind of clearly where, well, I guess monopoly on violence resides ultimately. But you need to win that terrain as well for many. And I think personally that that's an important terrain. As I said, I think plurality of strategies is the safest bet in a way. That's my Pascalian wager. But that doesn't mean that state, particularly the state formation that we have in the present, is sempiternal structure. No, I think we can well imagine a federation of corporate structures as proposed by Marit Bokchin, I don't know, as pursued by people in Rojava, as something that might supplant the world system of states. But we are not there, and I think kind of we are locked into the state formation as we have it for a long while, and we need to work on it.
I think it was answered, so I think I don't need, I just wanted to point, because I had this connection to the NGO questions before, but I was now thinking, and because Branislav also answered in the questions, in the answers already what I wanted to ask, but I was just thinking that conceptually for me it would be very interesting to tackle also these problems, to disentangle this notion of upravljanje, management. Because I think it's a kind of a crucial, for me it's a kind of a crucial affective and a kind of also technocratic force. So I understand different contexts, but it's a very interesting notion also in the relation to your question to NGOs and professionalization of cultural organizations and what kind of drive management actually also is in our society. And then again, Tomi, you then proposed this much more ecological notion of, and then I think conceptually it would be very, very interesting to disentangle also this notion if we would like to come to some more proposals. But that's just, I'm continuously stuck with it, also in a conceptual level, like what does it actually do performatively to us when we are using it? Also because of its crucial technocratic technocratic operation or role in the contemporary society. Yeah.
If I can just put in two remarks. I forgot to say about the state. I think problem of societal formation, which is sort of materialized in the form of the state, for me hinges essentially on the capacity to self-determine, to self-regulate the realm of necessity. No, if that can be done democratically without capitalist system, I think we have a radically transformed state formation. And then, yeah, that's how I see it kind of in theoretical terms. On the question of NGO, in my experience, the positive, the virtue of the NGO is conservation of capacity to act and maintenance of rapports of trust, trusting that we can transform something together, that we can seize the situation, the opportunity when it presents itself. And you need some continuity, forms of continuity for that. And we haven't been allotted many forms of continuity. Speaking of Croatia, I think come 91, nationalists enter into power, nationalists come to power, and they seize the institutions and expel everyone who's not with them sort of on the same agenda. And you have no other terrain than sort of civil society. organized civil society, NGOs. No? And then that's the problem. No, you operate in in a terrain that's already defined, and then obviously it has lots of pathologies, but it also operates in a dominative environment where it just replicates what there is. But still thinking like from our experience in Zagreb, I think it conserves capacity. So you need something that is kind of material resource, no space, some money to produce, I don't know, protest material or to pay people to do some, and that you have to find forms where enterprises, companies are not really that much suited, but could be in some situations.
I have some provocative question or opinion, maybe. Does the COVID pandemics and the interruption of all these ways and global trading and global connections and connections of labor and the goods is also something that has great impact on multinational capital and their connections that are around the globe. So will then the rise of nation states in these pandemics also have the impact on the systems, the states are something that are becoming more self-sufficient in terms of economy and in terms of food supplies and so on. Is this maybe also an opportunity for us, Precariat, that the multinational capital can be weakened by the pandemics? What do you think about?
Maybe a couple of things. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think that, the COVID-19 pandemic and all of that it is as much a symptom as it is a disease. And it is very much a symptom of that kind of really return to nativism, all new forms of nationalism worldwide. My frozen, so I don't know if you can hear or not. So
we can hear you. You were breaking up, but we could hear you.
it's
No longer.
Or maybe Branislav, you can just switch can you maybe just switch the video and stay just on the audio?
okay. Okay.
Now it's good.
Pandemic that COVID-19 became somehow attached to illiberal so-called democracies more than to that it actually was much more injurious and much more widespread in the so-called illiberal democracies rather than in well-organized societies. So the United States, Brazil, Russia, India, all of them are countries led by illiberal strongmen. So there is that essential relationship between COVID-19 and this return to nativism and nationalism. In terms of in transnational corporations, if we look at who profited the most from the pandemic in the US and worldwide, we'll see that they're precisely the digital capitalist transnational companies such as the Amazon, Netflix, and then you go from there. So they actually benefited from this.
I have a question, and I would like to use the opportunity because we didn't have a moment to interact with the previous panel, and all the questions are now coming to Branislav and Tom, which is great. But I wanted to go back to what Natasha was speaking in the last part of her session, because I thought the practice that you described during the pandemic was very interesting. In the context of Paris and France, where culture is highly institutional, and in the light of the crisis of care that pandemic just amplified or made more visible, I'm wondering how you view your own practice as a curator, because my understanding of curators is that they work with the regime of visibility. And all this that you talked about in the end is something that will remain invisible, difficult to represent, and the question is whether it should be represented, because we also know that curators very often waste topics or waste their political potential. So I'm wondering how you see your own practice as curator after this, if this was at all something that triggers a change. You also spoke about discomfort collaborating with, for instance, the biannual in Mechelen and so on. There are always problems. And I'm wondering what is the imperative, how to work with artists?
Thank you for the question, Bojana. I think it's just a start. It's like I said in the beginning, it's a beginning of an initiative. It's a starting point where I understand precisely where I try to understand what could be another way of de-hierarchizing the so professionally established relation between curators and artists when it comes to the level of representation or distribution or broadcasting through an institution or through a project. And there has been, you know, it's not, there is a history of that, and in the visual arts sector, as well as there is a history of places that are more prone to have such let's say relations or projects, also because there is maybe lack of institutional landscape, which is not precisely the case of, like you rightly point, France. And where I think it's interesting with what we are trying to do is that we try to inscribe a temporality, very consciously so, in the sense that with the skills that we have got together with Elena, by being the professional curators operating either for a longer time or being guest curators in the institutions where you come and go, so you don't have that. There is this frustration of leaving an impact, of having a longer term engagement, a more meaningful engagement with the artists or with the projects. I think what we are trying to do is work on a longer term by sustaining the practices that need to be sustained. And these are the practices that I talked a little bit about. I didn't go into all the details how these artists are working, but the way they are working with their own, within this notion of, let's say, caring practices, requests a temporality and requests temporality and duration in order that something visible might happen, and we might not intervene when this visibility will happen. That's what is the kind of point of this initiative. And where we see our skills coming in is precisely in listening, So that's why I mentioned this very hippie kind of looking picnic assemblies where we just sit down, eat, and talk to each other for about 3 hours, because it's about listening practice in order to understand what some of us needs at that moment in order to sustain oneself. And that's where we come in with maybe each of us actually, not only ourselves as those that have this curatorial background, but in pairing people together that don't know each other or might need, for example, now we are currently thinking with Elena how to enable Ismail to remain in France so that he's not taken back to Afghanistan where probably he will be killed. And he has to prove that he has an artistic record or some kind of creative activity. So we will curate a photo shoot for him. So I'm working with some students of mine, with some artists that are photographers, professional photographers, and who understand that this labor might not be, it's not a paid labor. We cannot for the moment because we are unfunded ourselves. So we are doing this in the light of some kind of social solidarity, but with understanding that these are creative subjects that might need some more time to come to some form of support, because now they are not supported, most of them. And at the same time, we bring in artists like Barbara Manzetti, who has a longer record of working within the field of performing arts, but she works in a radically different way. So she has also some other skills that might sustain these relationships, and this is where we are. And that's why we do radio antennas, because it kind of it enables us to talk. For the moment, we don't see how this can be actually visualized.